here. So, as far as Jews remaining in Nazi Germany within the Axis-controlled areas of Europe, so they thought that this persecution is kind of going to pass. By the time they realized that it's not a temporary thing, it was kind of impossible for them to get a visa because they had been stripped of their money, and Western nations were refusing to take in any more refugees. So the Nazis, trying to exterminate Europe's Jewish population, they would establish extermination camps. Jews were murdered in gas chambers. The Nazis also had concentration camps where the Jews worked until they died of disease, starvation, or exhaustion. All right, so pretty horrific series of events there. Okay, so within days of Germany's attack on Poland in 1939, President Roosevelt expanded the United States' army to 227,000 standing soldiers, and before the spring of 1940, many Americans had opposed a peacetime draft, but opinions would change after France surrenders to Germany in June of 1940. In September of that year, Congress approved the Selective Training and Service Act, a plan for the first peacetime draft in American history by a rather wide margin. More than 60,000 men would enlist in the month after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and at first the flood of recruits overwhelmed the Army's training facilities and equipment supplies. So in 1940, the Department of Agriculture had transferred over 350,000 acres to the War Department. New bases such as the Naval Air Station in Jacksonville, Florida were built, and existing ones like England Air Force Base were expanded. So many recruits lived in tents rather than barracks, as they carried sticks representing guns and practiced maneuvers with trucks labeled tank. New recruits were given physical exams and injections against smallpox and typhoid, and then they were issued uniforms, boots, and whatever available equipment they could get their hands on, and sent to basic training for about 8 weeks. Trainees drilled and exercised constantly, learned how to work as a team. Basic training helped break down barriers between soldiers. Recruits came from all over the country, and training together created tight relationships amongst troops. All right, so although basic training promoted unity, most recruits did not encounter Americans from every part of society. At the start of the war, the United States military was still segregated. African Americans were organized into their own military units, but white officers generally were in command of them. Military leaders typically assigned them to construction and supply units. So not all African Americans wanted to support the war. Nevertheless, most agreed that they should support their country. So one leading African American newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier, launched the Double V campaign to urge readers to support the war to win a double victory over Hitler's racism abroad and racism at home. So under pressure from African American leaders, President Roosevelt ordered the Army services to recruit African Americans and to put them into combat. So he also promoted Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Sr., to the rank of Brigadier General. And in early 1941, the Air Force created its first African American unit, the 99th Pursuit Squadron. Trained in Tuskegee, Alabama, the pilots became known as the Tuskegee Airmen. Commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the squadron helped win the Battle of Anzio in Italy. 3 other Tuskegee squadrons helped to protect American bombers as they flew to their targets, known as the 332nd Fighter Group. These squadrons flew 200-plus missions without losing a single member to an enemy aircraft. Also, the African-American 761st Tank Battalion was commended for their service during the Battle of the Bulge. Now, although Japanese Americans were not allowed to serve at first, as the war progressed, second-generation Japanese Americans, or the Nisei, served in the 100th Infantry Battalion and in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Almost half had been in internment camps in the Southwest, but together these units became the most decorated in the history of the United States military. About 500,000 Hispanic Americans served in the armed forces despite racial hostility against them. By the end of the war, 17 Hispanic Americans had received the Congressional Medal of Honor, and about one-third of all able-bodied Native American men between 18 and 50 served in the military during the war. More than 400 Navajo Marines served as code talkers, relaying critical information and orders over field radios as spoken messages coded in their own language, which, of course, is a regional language. It was pretty much impossible for anyone to decipher at that particular point, unless they just happened to have knowledge of it already. Of the 500,000 Jewish Americans who served in the military, about 52,000 were decorated for acts of bravery. Because so many European Jews died as a result of the Holocaust, American Jews would take on an increased leadership in the worldwide Jewish community. And although the military did not end all segregation during the war, it did eventually integrate military bases in 1943 and steadily would expand the role of African Americans within the armed forces. These successes paved the way for Truman's decision to fully integrate the military in 1948. All right, so the Army enlisted women for the first time, but they barred them from combat. Many Army jobs were administrative and clerical. So filling these jobs with women freed more men for combat, as Congress first allowed women in the military in May of 1942 by creating the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. It appointed War Department official Oveta Culp-Hobby as WAC's first director, and many women were very unhappy that WAC was not a part of the regular Army. About a year later, the Army replaced it with the Women's Army Corps, and Hobby would become a colonel. The Coast Guard, Navy, and Marines followed suit and set up female units. Another 68,000 women served as nurses in the Army and Navy, and about 300 women serving as WASPs, or Women Air Force Service pilots, made more than 12,000 flights to deliver planes for the war effort. So as far as fighting a global war goes, President Roosevelt was kind of troubled by this. Winston Churchill, not entirely. He knew that the key to victory depended upon industrial production, so he compared the American economy to a gigantic boiler. As war production continued to increase rapidly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, it was helped out by existing government plans to build thousands of warplanes and a two-ocean navy. Roosevelt believed that the government and business had to work together to prepare for this war, so he created the National Defense Advisory Committee and asked business leaders to serve on this committee. The president and his advisors believed that giving industry incentives to produce goods quickly was the best possible way to rapidly mobilize the economy. Normally, the government asked companies to bid on contracts to produce military equipment. It was a rather slow process, so instead, the government signed cost-plus contracts where it agreed to pay a company the cost to make a product plus a guaranteed percentage of the profit from its sales. Under the cost-plus system, the more and faster a company produced, the more money it would make. Although not cheap, the system got war materials produced very quickly and in large quantities. So Cost Plus convinced many companies to convert to war production, and Congress authorized the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to make loans to the companies that wanted to convert from making like household goods to making bullets for all that. All right, so what we see is by the fall of 1941, much had already been done to prepare the economy for war. Still only partially mobilized. The attack on Pearl Harbor changes all of that. By summer of 1942, almost all major industries and some 200,000 companies were converted to war production, and together they made the nation's wartime miracle possible. The automobile industry was very uniquely suited to mass-producing military goods, as automobile plants began making trucks, jeeps, and most importantly, probably tanks. Mass production was critical because the country that could move more troops and supplies the most quickly usually would win the battle. Automobile factories were producing things like rifles, helmets, artillery, and dozens of other pieces of military equipment, along with vehicles. So Henry Ford created an assembly line near Detroit for the enormous B-24 Liberator bomber. So the factory went on to build more than 8,600 total aircraft, and overall the auto industry made nearly a third of all wartime military equipment that was produced. Ford's remarkable achievement in aircraft production was more than matched by Henry Kaiser's shipyards, as the German submarines were sinking American cargo ships at a very terrifying rate. So the United States had to find a way to build cargo ships as quickly as possible. Kaiser used a method that emphasized speed and results. So instead of building an entire ship in one place from the keel up, parts were fabricated and brought to the shipyard and then assembled. Kaiser's shipyards built many different kinds of ships, but they were best known for their basic cargo ship, which they called the Liberty. When the war began, it took 244 days to build the first Liberty ship. After Kaiser's shipyards applied their mass production techniques, time to build one of these massive cargo ships dropped to just 41 days. Kaiser's shipyard built more than 30% of all American ships constructed during the war, and as war production grew, there were controversies between business leaders, government agencies, and the military that increased. So President Roosevelt created the War Production Board to direct priorities and production goals, later setting up the Office of War Mobilization to settle disputes between these different agencies. All right, so the war dramatically changed American society, and unlike much of Europe and Asia, which experienced a lot of devastation as far as buildings were bombed, entire towns were nearly wiped off the map, that type of thing. America benefited from being removed from the war in that regard. So mobilizing the economy finally ended the Great Depression, created 19 million new jobs, and nearly doubled the average family's income. So the improvement in the economy did not come without costs, though, as families had to move where the defense factories were located. Housing conditions were usually not that great. The pressures and prejudices of the era led to strikes, race riots, and rising juvenile delinquency. Goods were rationed, and taxes were higher, so workers earned more money, but also worked longer hours. So when the war began, American defense factories wanted to hire white men. With so many men in the military, however, there were simply not enough white men to fill these jobs. So under the pressure to produce, employers began to recruit women and minorities to fill these positions. During the Great Depression, many people believed married women should not work outside of the home, especially if they took the jobs that could go to men trying to support their family. Most working women were young, single, and employed in traditional female jobs like domestic workers or teachers, secretaries, that type of thing. The wartime labor shortage, however, forced factories to recruit married women for industrial jobs, traditionally reserved for the males. Although the government hired nearly 4 million women, mostly still for clerical jobs, the women working in the factories captured the public's imagination, as the great symbol of the campaign to hire women was Rosie the Riveter, a character from a popular song by the Four Vagabonds. The lyrics told of Rosie, who worked in a factory while her boyfriend served in the Marines. Images of Rosie appeared on posters, in newspapers, and in magazines, and eventually about 2.5 million women worked in shipyards, aircraft factories, and other manufacturing plants. By the end of the war, the number of working women had increased from 12.9 million to 18.8 million. Although most women were laid off or left their jobs voluntarily after the war, their success permanently changed American attitudes about what women were capable of in the workforce. Factories hired women, but they resisted hiring African Americans. Frustrated by this situation, A. Philip Randolph, the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, a major union for African American railroad workers, decided to act. He informed President Roosevelt that he was organizing a march on Washington. On June 25, 1941, Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802, which stated there shall be no discrimination in the employment of workers in defense industries or government because of race, creed, color, or national origin. So to enforce the order, he created the Fair Employment Practices Commission, the first federal civil rights agency to be put into action since the Reconstruction period. The wartime economy also benefited Mexicans, as in 1942, the federal government arranged for Mexican farm workers to help harvest crops in the Southwest as part of the Bracero program, which continued up until 1964. More than 200,000 Mexicans came to work during the war, many of them helping to build and maintain railroads. As migrant workers thus became very important to the success of the Southwest economic system. All right, so the wartime economy created millions of new jobs, leading 15 million Americans to move to find work. The growth of Southern California and cities in the Deep South created a new industrial region, which we refer to as the Sun Belt. Cities with war industries had to find room for thousands of arriving workers. Tent cities and parks filled up with tiny trailers would spring up, and Congress authorized $150 million for housing in 1940. In 1942, Roosevelt created the National Housing Agency to coordinate government housing programs. So many African Americans left the South for jobs in war factories in the North and West. However, African Americans often faced a lot of suspicion and intolerance. Racial violence erupted in Detroit, for instance, on Sunday, June 20th, 1943, as fighting between white and African American teens triggered a citywide riot that left 25 African Americans and 9 white individuals dead. In Los Angeles, the fear of juvenile crimes and racism against Mexican Americans became linked in the Zoot Suit riots. Popular with Mexican American teenagers at the time were zoot suits, which had very baggy pleated pants that were overstuffed knee-length jackets with wide lapels. Most men, to conserve fabric for the war, wore a victory suit that didn't contain a vest, had no cuffs, a very short jacket, and narrow lapels. So in June of 1943, after hearing rumors that zoot suiters had attacked several sailors, 2,500 soldiers and sailors began attacking Mexican American neighborhoods in Los Angeles. Of course, the whole first part of that was kind of fabricated, so kind of just senseless violence at that point. All right, so when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, many Americans turned their anger against Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans. On February 19, 1942, President Roosevelt signed an order allowing the War Department to declare any part of the United States a military zone. He must have felt justified 4 days later when a Japanese submarine surfaced north of Santa Barbara, California, and shelled an oil refinery. Most of the West Coast was declared a military zone, and people of Japanese ancestry were evacuated to tin internment camps farther inland. Thousands of people of German and Italian descent also had their freedom restricted. All unnaturalized residents of German and Italian descent, aged 14 or over, were deemed enemy aliens and subject to regulations including travel restrictions and the seizure of personal property. More than 5,000 were arrested and sent to live in military internment camps. So, both wages and prices began to rise quickly during the war because of the high demand for workers and raw materials. Worried about inflation, Roosevelt went on to create the Office of Price Administration and Civilian Supply and the Office of Economic Stabilization to regulate wages and to maintain certain prices. At the end of the war, prices had risen only about half as much as they had during World War I. While OPEX and OES worked to control inflation, the War Labor Board tried to prevent strikes. Most American unions issued a no-strike pledge, instead asking the War Labor Board to mediate wage disputes. By the end of the war, the War Labor Board had helped settle more than 17,000 disputes across the country. High demand for raw materials and supplies created shortages, and OPEX began rationing or limiting the purchase of many products to make sure enough were available for military use. Households picked up a book of rationing coupons every month for different kinds of food. When people bought food, they had to have enough coupon points to cover the purchases. Meat, sugar, fats, oils, processed foods, coffee, shoes, and gasoline were all rationed. Driving distances were restricted and the speed limit was set to 35 miles per hour to save gas and rubber. Americans also planted gardens in their backyards, schoolyards, city parks, and empty lots to produce more food for the war effort. The government encouraged these victory gardens by praising them in film reels, pamphlets, and official statements. The government also organized scrap drives to collect rubber, tin, aluminum, and steel. The federal government spent more than $300 billion during World War II, more money than it had spent from Washington's administration all the way to the end of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's second term in office. So Congress raised taxes, although not as high as Roosevelt requested, due to public opposition to large tax increases. As a result, the extra taxes collected covered only about 45% of the war's cost. Government war bonds were issued, more than $100 billion worth, sold to individuals, banks, and other financial institutions, and that made up a significant amount of the difference. So, in 1942, President Roosevelt also created the Office of War Information. The OWI's role was to improve the public's understanding of the war and to try and act as a liaison office with various media outlets. So the OWI established detailed guidelines for filmmakers, including a set of questions to be considered before making a movie, such as, will this picture help win the war? Despite the hardships, the overwhelming majority of Americans believed that the war had to be fought. Although the war brought many changes, most Americans united behind one goal, that being winning the war.